Hey everyone, I'm Barkha Dutt. You're with The Mojo Story. One of the fascinating conversations to have emerged this weekend is Prime Minister Modi's decision to mark the 14th of August as a day to remember the horrors of partition. This, of course, also happens to be the Independence Day of Pakistan. Our deep dive into this very interesting issue continues. Let's bring up our special focus on this broadcast today. We're looking at the Modi government's decision to commemorate 14th of August as a day for remembering the horrors of partition. Now, this is undoubtedly a cataclysmic event in our contemporary history that has perhaps not got the attention it should have. But how do you look at history without separating it from politics? And whose prism are you looking at this history through? Are we talking about the Indian perspective on this event, the Pakistani perspective? And indeed, what about the role of the British, whom perhaps the one thing India and Pakistan agree on have a large role of culpability? On this special broadcast today, we'll be talking to British historian, author, and screenwriter Alex Von Tunzelmann on the view from London, and in specific, the role of the British, perhaps a space that is not commented on as often as it should be, though in India and Pakistan, there are differing perspectives on whether the British were the main perpetrators or whether this was a festering wound that the British simply turned to their advantage. As I said, it is my pleasure now to welcome on the Mojo Story Alex Von Tunzelmann, an acclaimed author, a screenwriter, a historian, a woman of many parts. Her book, The Indian Summer, is a fascinating read if you're interested in those cataclysmic events of 1947. Alex, thank you so much for making time. And I've been following your Twitter thread with a lot of interest. And I'm just first wondering how you look at the decision by the Modi government to have such a day, and then what you think of the day that was chosen, which was the 14th of August, the day that Pakistan marks as its Independence Day.
Well, of course, first of all, this is a decision for Indians, not for British people to make. So I'm not going to perpetuate a colonial situation by telling Indians what to do. But my own opinion on it as a historian was that I think it's a very good idea to look at commemorating partition, to look at really trying to remember the events that led up to that and the reasons for that and interrogate that history. The choice of day is clearly highly controversial. To have gone for the 14th of August, which of course everybody knows is the day that Pakistan celebrates the end of empire and the beginning of its own independence, is obviously very political. And, other dates were available. I mean, for instance, I think the Partition Museum in Amritsar already celebrated a day on the 17th of August, which was a Remembrance Day. And so that's the announcement of the Radcliffe Award. So that made a lot of sense. So it's interesting why that date has not been chosen and instead the 14th has been chosen.
Yeah, and I take your point that it's not that one is looking to the West or to the British people or British commentators even for approval, agreement or disagreement. But of course, it's a very political decision and the politics of it leaps out at you. But more than that, I think one of the interesting conversations we've been having on our platform is in terms of assigning responsibility and culpability. And historians have differing perspectives on this. There are those who believe that this was about we the people, that this was a division, that it was we, ordinary people who turned into sort of, monstrous mobs. And we have sought to play the entire responsibility at the door of the British. There are others who look at the Radcliffe line as a kind of line of division that was arbitrarily drawn across, the heartland of a people. How do you see this as someone who studied this closely?
I think this is a question to which there will never be a simple answer. And actually, what we have to understand is that all of these things are factors. So, what I've tried to do really, especially in recent years since I wrote Indian Summer, is get people to look back and, really consider that partition didn't come out of nowhere, that really you have to look at the whole nature of British rule, the British Raj, and how that operated. And really, I think the key factors in that really led to the disasters after partition are, first of all, the kind of failures really to implement democracy, the real slowness on moving to giving Indians representation. Also the policy of divide and rule, particularly very much in terms of dividing people into lots and lots of separate groups. So not just sort of Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, but also, then also by subcategories, by caste. All of this was, something that the British really went to town, different reservations for the, different kind of caste groups and so on. And that really subdivided people again and again and again, and rather than uniting them. And thirdly, I think we really have to look at the violence of the British Empire. So, there's this sort of myth that everything worked very well under the British, and this is a myth that exists in Britain, in the UK now, as well as sometimes even in India and Pakistan, that things worked quite well until the disaster of partition, and that really isn't true at all. If we look back over the history of the British Empire, it was always enforced with violence. It was, there was an awful lot of violence, not only on a sort of level of conquest and government, but also actually on a low level, like for instance, regional policing and so on. And I think we have to understand that putting that violence into a culture had repercussions, had consequences. And so when we look at partition, this wasn't something that just sprung out of nowhere, that people went crazy and suddenly did this thing. It was something that was born of the consequences of this very, very divisive and violent imperial rule.
And I think that's a very interesting point, because from the very beginning, the attempt to, for example, have separate electorates was obviously part of an early design. What was that design? I mean, why, you say it wasn't just Hindus and Muslims, but was it to basically keep people at war with themselves so there could be no unified resistance to the empire?
I mean, absolutely. At some deep level, that was exactly what it was. And you can see that if you look at, for instance, Kipling's short stories, he says that very openly. He says, play them off against each other in strict supervision. That is the mode of our government. This is precisely what was done, and really quite intentionally. And I think if you're going to be charitable, you could say that there was also a side of that British rule that was the British themselves trying to understand this tremendous piece of land that they suddenly found themselves in charge of, and subdividing it was, categorizing people was a way to understand it, but that was used for divisive purposes very, very quickly. So, the result of that, even if perhaps in some people there were motives that were not completely toxic to do that, the result was, I'm afraid, often very, very toxic indeed for communities and societies within India.
One of the points I think you've made, and in interviews and in your writings, is that it is impossible to understand the present of India and Pakistan without understanding partition. And to that extent, we've had Indian researchers like Ashish Nandi who've worked on memory and partition, how memory is sometimes suppressed, how this is almost like a psychological disorder, apart from being sort of the collision of two states. Do you think that what is a tragedy for India is actually identity for Pakistan? And therefore, when you talk about history and partition, it's a really complicated question, even factoring in what the British regime did.
I think there's actually probably pretty major generational trauma in both India and Pakistan as a result of partition. And we've seen this and understand it now as historians, that actually trauma is something that can be passed down through generations and that people inherit and continue to develop and experience. And, I think that's a very, very serious issue that people have been dealing with. And we know that the partition generation themselves, the people who really were adults at the time who experienced it firsthand, and of course there are not very many of them left, often never spoke about their experiences. They very often did not tell their families and so on what they had been through. They kept their secrets very closely. And actually, I think places like the Partition Museum in recent years have been trying to do oral histories and trying to bring that back very late. But actually, a lot of these people really didn't speak for a long time. And that is a sign of being very traumatized. And I think that was the case on both sides of the border. And, the result of this was that an awful lot of people went through some really appalling situations, and really, and that's not necessarily divided neatly one side to the other.
I was just going to bring up the Partition Museum, and we were talking to Kishwar, and on one of our programs there was somebody from Bengal who said that all you Punjabis, the story of partition has been dominated by the partition of Punjab, and everybody has forgotten Bengal, and in some ways the strange schizophrenic love-hate nostalgia which engulfs the Punjab conversation is very different when it comes to Bengal. And Bengal then gets further partitioned because Bangladesh is born. And I'm just wondering how you put all of those pieces together. And when you say the word partition, or when I say the word partition, do we automatically think mostly Punjab?
Yeah, Yes, and I think that's actually a problem as well. I think you're absolutely right to bring that up, that, we often talk about this, and when we talk about it in a modern sense, we often talk very casually about India and Pakistan. We don't even mention Bangladesh, where, of course, there are also people who experienced this, for whom this is their history in a very big way. And I mean, I think with Bengal, the partition there gets much less attention because even though there was a great deal of violence, it didn't have the same kind of scale of violence as you saw in Punjab, but that doesn't mean that it was without trauma. It doesn't mean that in any way that wasn't, a kind of very major event in and of itself. And of course, Bengal also had been partitioned before in 1904-5 by the Brits, had already happened once. So that trauma was being then repeated again. So really, Bengal, had its own very complicated experience there, which I think doesn't get discussed anything like enough, quite honestly, when we're talking about partition.
Yeah, I want to return to sort of the role of the British Empire, and there have been, commentators like Shashi Tharoor, of course, a Congress politician as well, who have argued that there must be reparations, that the British people or the British state, owes something more to the people of the subcontinent, to India. I'm wondering what the sort of feeling is among the British people. Is this something that even gets spoken about? You had countries like Germany who had very complicated confrontations with their past. Has that process even begun to take place in the United Kingdom?
I would have to say, sadly, really not. I think we don't discuss it in the United Kingdom anything like enough. And I know it always shocks audiences in India and Pakistan when I give talks there, when I'm very often asked, what do you learn in schools about the British Empire in India? What do you learn about partition? And I have to say nothing. It is not taught. Wow. It's something that's an optional subject. It's not taught, generally speaking, to most students, and they have literally no idea about it. Unless people inform themselves, they are not brought up with a knowledge of this. And I think that's a massive, massive problem. And really, a lot of my work and a lot of my argument has been exactly this, trying to ask the British as well to think about our involvement in that history and to really kind of, put this at the center of our understanding of what happened. And I think, again, this is a bit of a problem with the partition narrative that says everything was great under the Brits until this cataclysm of partition, is, again, that lets the British Empire off the hook to a very great extent. It doesn't ask the deep and serious questions of the British Empire that the British need to. So that narrative is, of course, very popular in the UK because it fits a certain image, but actually it really does need challenging. And I know it is most certainly being challenged by scholars in the subcontinent. And I very much hope that more and more Brits will read and listen to that wonderful work that is being done.
But I'd be very curious to know, how is the empire then taught in schools? Do the British people or do British children grow up learning about Gandhi, who leads a non-violent struggle against the British people? For instance, like how is empire taught? I'm really curious.
It's not. It's not taught.
At all?
No, not really. I mean, there's a few special subjects within history. So if you pursue history to a reasonably high level, your school may pick an optional subject, which may include India or the empire and so on. But most British students, most of the time, the history is very much focused on the Tudor period, the Industrial Revolution, World War I, World War II. These subjects are done again and again. And actually, there is depressingly little focus, I think, on these much, kind of more global questions, these huge questions of the British Empire and the British role. I mean, even the early empire, even Clive is no longer discussed in British schools. Cecil Rhodes is not discussed in British schools. None of these things, come up in terms of the global British Empire. And I think that's a massive problem. I'm definitely myself working to try to change that. But, there's something that the British government also has a political agenda, as all governments do. And generally speaking, it prefers its history patriotic, as many nations do. So there's a problem because, of course, the minute you start discussing imperial history, it doesn't necessarily fit patriotic narratives from the British point of view.
And I suppose when it comes to discussing figures like Churchill, who are glamorized, for example, in Netflix series like The Crown, but here from an Indian perspective are seen as, absolutely evil. So, how does history then retain any hope for objective scholarship when it comes to the empire, imperial history, our colonization, and who we pick as villains or heroes of the time?
Well, I think there is scholarship being done in Britain as well as in many, many other countries on all of this. But the problem is there's often a very big gap between the scholarship and then the sort of public perception, the public narrative and the popular narrative that gets play in media and TV and, all of this kind of stuff. There's a big gap between those things a lot of the time. And actually, Churchill really is a flashpoint in the UK now. There has been a lot of fuss about, my most recent book is called Fallen Idols, 12 Statues That Made History. And, the Churchill statue in London has been very controversial. It's been, attacked in, like, for instance, last year in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter protests, somebody wrote was a racist on the Churchill statue, and that caused very great upset. Now, of course, as historians, we know that actually Churchill very much expressed racist opinions, certainly about India, certainly about Indians, and also about other groups. This is not really in contention, but the general public, often who are, have been brought up with this very patriotic image of Winston Churchill as this great savior who won World War II, often find that very troubling and very difficult to come to terms with. And so, really, I want to ask people to look past simplistic heroes and villains. You can have complex figures who might, have very, very great achievements and might still also have some problems. These people are not completely black and white. There are always shades of grey. And so, we have to sort of start understanding that the story is more complicated and it's not going to be simply good and bad heroes and villains all the time for us.
When you were writing Indian Summer, during your research, was there something that you found that you had to unlearn or look at differently, maybe shed your own identity as a British writer? I'm just wondering what that process was like.
I think I was lucky in that my father was also an immigrant from New Zealand, and therefore I always had a perspective that wasn't particularly British triumphalist, because I had a father who'd lived in the colonial world, as it were, and therefore was brought up with a perspective outside that. But certainly there was an awful lot to be unlearned. And I mean, really, the way I suppose that I came to this story was very much with an understanding that, as I think it is for many Brits, because we're not taught it in schools, was based on films like, Richard Attenborough's movie Gandhi, which kind of really presents, it's a very beautifully made film, but it presents this kind of quite stately process with lots of, reasonable people on both sides and, a sort of inexplicable horror that happens. But, there's this sort of narrative that, again, is very popular in Britain, as well as I think, in India for some time, that there's kind of this non-violent resistance and it's very, very dignified. And then the British, of course, are persuaded by this non-violence that they, because they're rational and decent, that they must leave and that this is how it happens. And of course, that's not true at all. In real life, the British resistance to the non-violent movement was extremely violent and was, not in any way rational or reasonable. And it was a much more complicated story. And of course, Gandhi himself is a complicated and controversial figure who, of course, has been discussed extensively in recent years. And so sort of, I suppose, trying to take it away from this kind of this image that has been presented of this very dignified story that I suppose serves many interests on both sides, and actually looking for a more complex story about people. And again, I think when it comes to people like Mountbatten, well, it's very, very easy, and it has been for a lot of historians in Britain, to say, oh, Mountbatten is the problem. Mountbatten sped up partition, and this, so it's all his fault. This is what happened. And again, the minute you look into it, it's really far more complicated than that. He wasn't acting alone. He had been, put in this position for a reason. There are all sorts of factors. He didn't have troop support. He didn't have all sorts of things. And actually, we can see, I'm sure a lot of your viewers have been watching with horror, as I have, the situation in Afghanistan in the last few days. And once again, we see that it's not just a matter necessarily of a withdrawal when things suddenly go wrong. Then actually what you have to look at is the 20 years preceding that and what has happened there, and all the mistakes that have been made have led to this point. So it's not just a case of, this one, it was all going perfectly and this one thing goes wrong. I think anytime I hear that story as a historian, I immediately have my doubts about that story. Yeah. I always think it's going to be more complicated.
Yeah, I agree. And there's always that search for sort of either binaries or sort of reducing extremely complex characters into cardboard cutouts. But, it remains a very live political question in India and in Pakistan, who was responsible for partition, to the extent that when L.K. Advani, who was a major BJP leader, went to Pakistan and actually sort of said some words that appeared to praise Jinnah, he actually had to leave. He actually had to resign his party post because there was such a backlash backlash to it. And so I don't want to ask you that in that simplistic way, but I do want to ask you, when you say the right questions are not asked of the role of the British, what are some of those questions? One, of course, is that partition wasn't just this law and order sort of event, and which the British lost control over. What are some of the other questions that need to be asked that aren't asked? And if you had to place primary responsibility for this rupture, where would you place it?
I don't hesitate to say I would place primary responsibility on Imperial British rule and on the history of that I think a lot of these problems were born out of that. However, I would also say there is plenty of blame to go around when we look at partition, and lots of people who are involved played their particular role in a certain way that deserves blame and was bad. This doesn't mean that it somehow absents responsibility from anybody else. It doesn't. I mean, for every murder, there was a murderer. For every rape, there was a rapist. We do not take away responsibility for these people for their personal acts that they chose to do. Nonetheless, understanding the context of it, I think, is very important. And that's why I say I think we really need to look again and think again at the long role of Imperial Britain, not just the year we've looked at so much at 1946, 47, 48 and what happened then, but actually the much deeper history beyond that, the really deep history of British rule.
When do you think, at which point, because, we've also studied this in a very simplistic way, the East India Company comes, and how from the East India Company, from a trading organization, political ambitions, colonial roots take shape. If you had to, as a historian, say, this is the point at which dividing the people of this nation starts, what point would that be? Because another romanticized narrative around the British history is, it's the British who organized India into a nation. The British gave you this language, English. The British gave you the rail tracks. There would be no India if there were no colonialists. You hear a lot of that even today in India.
You do. And you certainly hear it in Britain as well. And I think, it's very hard to give one particular date. There's a number of dates that you could look at, but I think what you really have to look at is that actually all of these dates probably have an impact. So you could look at 1870 when the census begins and when really Indians are divided into categories legally from that point on. You could look at 1857 to 58 and the outcome of that and the British takeover from there. You could go back earlier, though. You really can look at the histories before then of British Macaulay going back to the idea of creating a separate caste of Indians that was British by culture and education, even though they're Indian by blood and color, and that's 1832. So you can keep going back. There's plenty of roots of this that go very, very deep. And again, I'm sorry, it is frustrating, but there really aren't simple answers to these questions. And I think it is a complicated story. So what I would encourage really is for people to, look back, and certainly if they are going to remember the horrors of partition, just consider that the roots of this are very, very deep and very, very complicated.
Yeah. Finally, coming from a family that actually moved from Sialkot in Pakistan to Delhi as refugees, and so many friends and relatives I know grew up on these stories, so many people did not believe that partition was permanent. And even those who accepted that partition was permanent thought that the borders would remain open. Indeed, Jinnah's own speech to this effect is cited again and again. What does your research show? Do you find this another romanticized, sepia-tinted narrative that partition was not meant to be that people thought they would go back home? You keep hearing these accounts. We didn't even lock it. We just latched our homes and we left, and we thought we'd come back one day. And then, of course, that one day never came. But till the 1960s, we forget that the borders were open.
Absolutely. And I mean, even Jinnah, we know, did not sell his house in Bombay as it then was, now Mumbai. He kept his house. It's still there. I mean, there's now, I think, a dispute over it and all of this. And, that is a very clear indication that he must have thought that it would be somehow possible for him to keep traveling back, or his family to keep traveling back in a kind of simple way. So we can certainly see that people at the time perhaps had a different perspective on what would happen here. And I think that's something, even since I wrote Indian Summer back in 2007, when this book first came out, I actually ended it on this quite optimistic note, hoping that actually perhaps the wounds of time will fade and things will get easier. And actually that hasn't happened. What we've seen is that really relations between India and Pakistan have become, very tense at many points, and that really the wounds, if anything, are kind of the scabs keep getting ripped off. It keeps getting rawer and rawer and more difficult. As you say, actually, in the early years, it was easier at some points for that to happen. And I think that's a very great sadness, really. And ultimately, what that shows is that divide and rule, unfortunately, worked incredibly well, that there is still a legacy of that.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that one of the things that's also happened is that the entire idea of a Muslim nationhood has also been challenged because, from Pakistan was born Bangladesh, there's Pakistan's own treatment of the Shias and the Ahmadiyas. In Afghanistan, we're now shuddering to think what might happen to the Hazaras. So the idea of religion as the driving force of nationhood, has been called into question repeatedly. But Indians think partition was terrible. For Pakistan, it's their entire identity. So just a last question on that. As a historian trying to make sense of these differing perspectives and very guttural for the people of the subcontinent, really, how do you separate emotion from fact? Is there an empirical set of facts? And if there are, what's that one overarching truth of partition that none of us have confronted yet?
It's so complicated. I mean, no, there isn't a set of facts that is independent. And one of the huge problems with partition and the history of that is that actually it's incredibly hard to establish the facts. And we know that the reasons for that are that actually at the time there was chaos. And I'm sure, once again, that this will be the same when historians are looking back at what's happening now in Afghanistan. That actually there were, records I was looking at when I was doing the research for this book where British local kind of governors would say, I have stopped reporting a massacre unless at least 1,000 people are dead because I've got so many that I can't make a record of the numbers. So we don't even have a remotely accurate estimate of how many people were killed, displaced, etc. All the numbers that we quote on this are really very, very vague estimates. We don't know what happened. And this is, an awful situation for history. It's very hard even to get a grasp on what it really means and what it meant to all these individual people. So, I think it is very difficult to do that. And there isn't, therefore, a kind of perfect, clean set of facts that is separate from emotions about that. I mean, as historians, what we try to do is not have no emotions, but to distance ourselves from it and look at things, empirically as much as possible. We try and look at research, but of course, a lot of these testimony are people's memories, and of course, those will have opinion in them. You cannot, there isn't a sort of clinical scientific way to do this. So actually, I think what we have to understand is this is a hugely complicated, globally important subject, partition, and these overlapping stories, we need to dig in and understand the complexity of them, not look for simple answers, but actually embrace the difficulty and complexity of it. And that's certainly why in Britain we need to teach it in schools and learn much more about it. But, in India and Pakistan, that is being done in different ways. And as I say, there is good scholarship, but of course this is also bound up with people's emotions very understandably. And, I wouldn't tell people not to have feelings about this. Of course, people can have feelings.
Yeah, well, it's been fascinating. And I think the one thing, irrespective of where people stand on the date chosen to mark remembrance of the horrors of partition, it's got a conversation going, and it's a conversation that we've kind of suppressed, or it would just express itself in very predictable ways of either complete romanticization or complete hostility. And the truth is always so many shades in between. It's just been so interesting. Alex Von Tunzelmann, thank you, the author of Indian Summer, her latest work, Fallen Idols, and I know you're also a screenwriter and really enjoy your work. Thank you, Alex. Pleasure having you on the show, and hope to have you back soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalists.